Hello.
Hello.
Uh, this is another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of POW, and I am delighted to be joined today by Kathy McLean. And what I like to do, Kathy, I always like to ask people to start out by just telling us a little bit about their background and how they ended up in the magical museum business. So maybe you could start there.
I have to be careful because I could probably spend the whole time talking about how I ended up in museum business because it's so much time I've spent. But
give us the short version.
The short version. I was lucky to have been hired at the Oakland Museum at a time. I was hired right after it had opened. A couple of years after it had opened, and it was shut down. It was during the Black Panther time, of course, and Oakland was a really wild and crazy place, as was Berkeley, and that's where I was living, in Berkeley. And the CETA program, the Comprehensive Education Training Act program, which still exists today in some forms, which was the contemporary or more modern version of the WPA, infused a lot of money into the arts and hired lots of people. And the Oakland Museum had a lot of CETA money. And so I was one of the young people. There were probably about 30 of us that were hired just at the Oakland Museum. So it was a pretty amazing time. And a very diverse group of people to implement kind of the change that needed to happen because the community of Oakland had picketed the museum after it opened and shut it down, saying that they did not see themselves inside. This was 1969 that happened. I was hired in the end of 73, and I was hired into the Special Exhibits and Education Department, which was run by an African-American artist, Oakland artist, who became my boss, and we were responsible for community engagement. We were the arm of the museum that said, okay, now you're going to see yourselves here, and you're going to see yourselves here big time. And so we had all kinds of festivals, and every community group in the East Bay, Northern California, was represented, came in, wanted to do festivals, wanted to do exhibitions. We had the first exhibition on treaties and genocide with the native people, and we used the word genocide. It was in the 70s. So in a way, and from there I moved, I was there for 7 years, then I started my own independent exhibitions company. I did that for a while, then got hired at the Brooklyn Children's Museum, then the Maryland Science Center, then came back to the Bay Area because my husband said, I love California. And so I'm going home. Are you coming with me? And so I quit and came back and started up my business again, and then ended up at the Exploratorium. But on and off consulting in-house and inside, in-house and inside, back and forth, for all those years. And I think the more I think about it now, the more I realize that some of my frustration, or just my impatience with the museum community, often is because we were doing things there at the Oakland Museum I thought was standard practice. And in fact, it's still radical. When I tell people what we did during that time, it's still radical today for museums. So when people say, oh, we can't possibly do that, and I have over my whole career gotten very short and impatient with people because, oh yes, you can do this. And I've seen the result, I've seen how powerful it can be. So that's what brought me here to this point. My boss, Ben Hazard, who just 3 months ago just died. And I'm so sad that I never got to tell him face to face in the later years how much he really influenced my work and my perspective in museums. And he had a great perspective as far as I was concerned. And he was actually appointed by, I can't even remember, Johnson. I can't remember who the president was that started when it was the Institute of Museum Services. It was called IMS. He was one of the first members of IMS. So it was an exciting time.
Cool. Well, that's a short but interesting history, of course. And I guess maybe a way to segue into our conversation together, I'll just say maybe one reason I like you so much is we are both impatient with the museum business, because we're like, what do you mean? I've done this before. Like, I've worked at places. What do you mean you can't do this? So I think in the spirit of thinking about what we can do instead of what we can't do, I'd like to talk a little bit or hear from you a little bit about what you think we can do to change the way we think about exhibitions and developing exhibitions writ large. So I know you are a can-do person too, and an impatient person, which is great. So what do you think? We're sort of in crazy times when we're recording this now, of course, during COVID-19, but even before that, I think both you and I resonated with me. You've been a gadfly, a person to prod the business to think a little bit more about what we're doing and not just sleepwalk through what we're doing, especially as it relates to developing exhibits. So maybe I just throw the ball your way and be interested to hear what are some things you think we can do in the museum world to improve our thinking or improve our actions about developing exhibitions.
You know, I feel like there's a glass wall that's just, we're walking, you and I, and there are lots of others, but not as many as we need in order to really shift the practice to something more vital. You know, we tend to feel like, or I at least feel like I'm an outlier rather than, you know, making the charge. But there's a bit, you know, the shift to what we can do is really a tiny little shift. It's not like changing everything. It's like when you have an aha moment, you know, when you see something and it's like, oh my God, it's that close to allowing us to providing us the open space, enough room to be much more creative, have much more fun, have it be much more enjoyable, have it be much more dynamic, and be much more essential to the lives of our community in a way. And it was interesting because a young woman, Mekhala Krishnan, who now works at Think Design, and she's an exhibit developer, and she and I met when I did some work at the Philadelphia Museum of Art when she was there. And she was asking me, like she said, she had noticed that lots of museums are now leaping to get a lot of content online, right? It's like, okay, so now that we can't do it in person-to-person real space, let's just put all our exhibits and all our content online. And so there's this push content thing going on. And she said, is that really what we want to be doing in response? Is that the right kind of response that we should be having right now? And I said, I think not. I think that, you know, as museums, as members of the kind of the human community, and as relatively creative organizations, or organizations that, at least in spirit, celebrate the creative energies of human beings. I think that's why museums exist. Maybe not just the creative spirit, maybe also more negative things, but it's really it's the evidence of what it means to be a human being. Every museum has some role to play in that kind of evidence. And we just need to be more like we're being right now with our neighbors. I was thinking about this. One of the things that the COVID-19 seclusion has done, which I find very interesting, and we're just starting out on this, so we're clueless about. Everybody keeps saying it's going to change the world, it's going to change the world, and we are clueless about how. But I think one thing that it's really hit me quickly is that all of these people who I've seen on for example, on television, news reporters in particular, doctors, actors, singers, people that you've always seen on stage are now, because out of necessity, you're now seeing them in their homes, in their backyards, in their dens. You're seeing their family pictures on the wall, and it's
their natural element,
their natural habitat, and it's so much more humanizing. And I think that's what I've been pushing for us to do all these years, is to just, as institutions, be more humanizing and to get off the stage, to get off the idea that we're on stage doing some kind of performative delivery of something for the betterment of all of you out there in the audience. And it takes lots of different forms. And we can do that right now. It's hard for me to get into what we do differently. It seems so simplistic, and I say it over and over again, and it's gotten to the point now where, I'm like an old lady and I say it and everybody rolls their eyes and says, oh, right, or I raise my hand in a meeting and I just say something and they go, Kathy, not you again.
Here comes Kathy again.
Yeah. Oh no. And maybe it's because I'm not communicating it well, but it's really what we need to do is be more human with each other. And that means in a museum setting, when we're creating exhibitions, that we're not the auteurs doing our monograph to contribute to the world. We're not scholars. Most of the people who work in museums are not scholars, even though, lots of people will say they're scholars, but most of the curators I've worked with, they know something about the material, but they're not deep scholars. They've had the kind of education that you and I have had. So the notion that we're delivering something, if you want to talk about delivery, I have a whole new metaphor for delivery now with the food. I get my Good Eggs. It's a Bay Area food company that has very high values for their employees. So unlike Instacart and unlike Amazon, where the people are striking because they feel like they've been put in really untenuous situations and dangerous situations, the people at Good Eggs are part of the family. And they're delivering the food, right? The difference is in the attitude towards the people that you're working with. And I just, I read something, I'm sorry, I'm talking so much and I wanted you to, but Suzanne McLeod is coming out with a new book. It comes out in August, and she sent me a copy of it. I wrote a little review for the back cover, and it's called Museums and Design for Creative Lives. And it's a scholarly publication, so you have to kind of slog through some of the scholarly rhetoric and the defending, like having to reference everybody so that you defend that you're building on past scholarship. But it's pretty profound. She's mentioning things like, and she's bringing in examples of people talking about things like the difference is as simple as when you sit down at the table to work on a project together, that there's a fundamental agreement from day one that we are all equals in this and that we're all working on this together. Not that we're going to bring people along. Not that, okay, we're going to bring some community people in and we're going to bring them along with the process.
We want their input.
Yeah, right. But only in doses, here and there. But that we're all at the table together. And that's, sorry, that goes my phone. Totally random. I've been in isolation for 3 weeks now, 4 weeks. So my conversation skills, and I know my husband really well. So my conversation skills are a little, I jump from idea to idea. So I'm apologizing for my scattershot approach to talking about this, but it's too many stimuli coming in that I haven't been able to get out. It's as easy, you know this too. It's as easy as coming together around the table.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it's interesting that you brought up thinking about your neighbors when you're in isolation, or when you're sheltering in home, or social isolation, whatever you want to say about this, and also the delivery from Good Eggs. I mean, it seems like a lot of what we're talking about is a mindset issue. Not a resources issue.
It's
I think what constantly scares people away is like, oh, we can't do this because always, time and money, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money. People say this all the time to me about prototyping and stuff too, and I'm like, listen, that's not what we're talking about here. But I mean, it's interesting also in terms of the mindset, and thinking about your neighbors and thinking about people at this time during this pandemic. I mean, the way that people are interacting with their neighbors is, what do you need? What can I help you with? What do you need? And it goes back to what you were saying about this sort of burst of online programming, or transfer of resources to online, or taking existing stuff and putting it online. And how do we even know if that's what people need or want? It's not like we asked anybody. And so I just wonder about that.
That was Mekla's question. Do people really want all that extra content right now? Maybe they need something like a place where they can pick up their vegetables, or a place where, or maybe they need, who knows, somebody to entertain them. I don't know. It's pretty difficult to figure it all out.
Well, in the spirit of helping to figure things out, and in the spirit of being can-do, maybe we can talk just a little bit about some of these ways to shift mindsets, to maybe get people to think, now that they have more time to think, but after eventually we come out of the end of these difficult situations, and museums will reopen and be thinking or rethinking about what they want to do. What are some things in particular that you might highlight as, I was first going to say roadblocks, but let's just say things for people to really consider in terms of mindsets about exhibit or exhibition development specifically, that you think would be good things for people to chew on a little bit? So maybe a few that particularly stand out that you think are sort of ripe for reconsideration.
From the point of view of the people creating exhibits?
Yeah, or just the process. I mean, even like we're talking about, and you mentioned your work, those many years ago in Oakland, about more meaningfully and perhaps forcefully being advocates for the communities and being inclusive, and really setting up a situation where everyone was on par in terms of creating exhibitions with communities. Things that stand out for you? I mean, it's sort of, I'm trying to put a positive spin on this, but it also is sort of starting and thinking about, well, what are the things that often get in the way of being more expansive about developing exhibitions, or often become roadblocks? How can we sort of stop and think about ways we could do different aspects of developing exhibitions differently, and to chew on those different aspects. I don't know if that's a good jumping off point or not.
Yeah, that's good. I think that this experience that we're going through right now is a good model for us, or a good example for us to think of when we go back to work, or we are working now. Let's not say go back to work, because I think there is no going back. And the notion that when we get back to normal, or we're getting normal again, or it normalizes, that's really our reptilian brain, thinking that, we're going to be out laying eggs in the sunshine again.
Make all the bad stuff go away. Just bring me back. Just put me in one of those spaceship tubes for 3 years. And that's what my wife said. I wish I could go on one of those spaceships and just wake up when it's all over. I'm like, yeah. Okay.
Well, so I think this experience for me personally, what it's done is, as I said, seeing people like news reporters in particular that I've seen for years, and now they're sitting in their little den and they're talking, and I'm seeing, their stuff around, and is that this is kind of an equalizer of sorts, that we all have these backgrounds we all have these spaces. Our personal space is now becoming more public. And in a way, we could learn from that when we think about making exhibitions, that again, we say, here's where I'm coming from. Here's who I am. Where are you coming from? Where are you? And what can we do together that is valuable, that's value added, that creates something new and different that we don't even know what it is yet. But, all we know is that things are going to be very different after this. So what can we create together and see what happens? Having that kind of an approach, which, in my old language is like having an experimental approach, where we say, okay, here's our hypothesis. Now let's do an experiment, and maybe we'll fail, maybe we won't, but let's try it and find out where we end up. And I'm always fighting against this need that we all have to say, here's where we want to end up. This is how we're going to make an exhibition, and this is what it's going to look like, and this is what it's going to feel like, and it's going to be great, and people are going to love it, and people are going to think that we're really brilliant, creative people. And that's not really where the fun, that's not where the enjoyment is. The enjoyment is in the journey and the saying, what can we do together? And learning something from each other and creating something in common that is something different than what we started with.
So it's interesting. I mean, it seems to me that there's sort of this dynamic tension. On one hand, the things that are, essentially, we're looking for ways to make museums and the exhibition development process more human and more vulnerable, in a sense, more open and vulnerable.
Yep.
But that often, as you well know, often is sort of in direct conflict with this institutional front that somehow gets attached to a museum. Like, well, we can't sort of be human scaled, or we can't sort of be vulnerable in our processes, because that sort of implies that we're not, as you indicated before, that we're not sort of coming down from the mountain with the delivered wisdom and just presenting it for all of the unwashed masses here. It feels sometimes like that's the way museums act. But what you're describing is completely antithetical to that. So what would you suggest to people working on exhibitions, whether they're maybe a visitor or more likely a museum person if they're watching this, what might be some ways that they can inculcate more of that vulnerability or a human face to the process and the institution, if you like?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm seeing evidence of it, with people, like the things that, well, like singing on the balconies in Italy, or really creative things that come out of a need to reach out in a new way. And I think if we could, as we sit down to think about exhibitions, think of ourselves and ask ourselves, how can we reach out in a new way that infuses what we're doing with something surprising to us as well? I mean, you're looking at all these different things that people are doing. All the music now, the Yo-Yo Ma piece that got everybody going, and now I was just watching Steve Martin playing the banjo in his backyard, and I'm thinking, what is going on here? There's something really, and so Steve Martin, if he were in the museum world, he would be saying, I am the curator of humor, and I am the humor expert, and so therefore I am going to deliver humor. And instead, he's playing the banjo. And so I still think that the roles that we have, these they're like cardboard cutout characters or characterizations of who we should be when we're in these roles, what we should bring to the table, and how we should behave. I think that's what's really tripping us up. And in times like this kind of crisis that we're in right now, it's like everything's been thrown up in the air, and so you don't have the ability to have that cardboard kind of avatar in front of you saying, I am the expert, or I am the designer and only I know how to make things look good, or and of course we want the experts. And also it's a really interesting time, because no, we don't want people who make Hostess Twinkies to decide what's going to happen to us in terms of testing. We've got we need expertise, but it's not like we're not throwing the expertise out, but the expertise is being used and digested in a different way than when we sit down and say, okay, we're going to make an exhibition about X, and so then the person who knows the most about X is the one who decide what's in the show. It's, I don't know. This is babbling, and you could edit this all out.
I'm a very light editor. No, I mean, it seems like also the delivery mechanisms are important, and the thinking about what and how museums should be sharing. And if, really, especially in the age of the internet, we should be in the information business. Our friend Beverly Sorrell would say, we're not in the information business, we're in the interpretation business. And so, I think, well, what does that mean if we're not focusing on information, but we're setting up situations where people might be sort of naturally inspired to sing together when they come into an environment in the museum, in a music exhibit, whatever, what have you. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
I'd just be interested for you maybe to run with the ball for a second on this distinction between information and interpretation, and what that means in terms of the way we might be thinking about our work in developing exhibitions.
I think that I think information and interpretation, we have to take kind of both of those ideas, which are pretty, they got a lot of baggage with them, and put them somewhere else and say, what can we do? Here's where we are right now. What can we do that would give us joy, not just have fun, but give us joy, would surprise us, would give us hope, would energize us. You have somebody coming in? Are you, oh, sorry, I'm like, oh, who's there?
If only people could see what was happening off screen, but they can't. Please continue.
I'm doing this, so sorry, everybody. I really like to know what's happening over there in the other. Is that your dining room that you're in?
This is the nerve center of Power World headquarters during the current crisis. Anyway.
So I think it's really saying it goes back to years, for many years, people have been asked, really kind of excellent, terrific exhibition creators have been asked, what really makes a good exhibition? What makes an exhibition that's going to be very compelling for people? And a lot of that hasn't changed over time. And I think it's still the same. And what makes a good podcast? It's, something unusual, something inspirational, something counterintuitive, something that surprises you, something that you never thought about before, something that makes you have questions. You want to know more about it, or you're a bit confused. It's kind of counterintuitive. It's a little bit cognitively destabilizing. Those kinds of things that engage us in conversation with each other, or wondering why, or sitting up late in the night talking about the meaning of life, all those kinds of things that they can be actually the kind of essence of a museum exhibit experience as well. It just takes allowing those things to come forward, and then we come back to what you and I both know very well, which is, how do you find those things? When you find those things, you don't just dream them up in your own head. You don't just sit in an empty room in isolation like we are right now and then come up with the brilliant things that are going to really attract people when we all come back to going to museums. No, they come up in conversation with each other. They come up when one person says, look at this. What do you think this is? Well, I've used this a long time, but what does it look like to you? Like, Paul, what could this be? You know what this is, but what could it be? Imagine, what could this be that's really different than anybody else has ever said? You have any idea?
Hamster race car.
Yeah. Or looking at somebody skiing on a glass slope, right?
Yeah, there you are. No, it's super interesting to me, because when you just spoke about the qualities that really hit people about excellent, let's just say excellent exhibitions, you weren't talking about the sort of intellectual corner of that triangle. You were talking about the emotional and social parts of that triangle. And I think, I always think, growing up in Detroit and having been as many times, and now even though I don't live in Detroit, having been as many times as I have to the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Diego Rivera Court and the fabulous frescoes, murals there. It's always I would say it's a transcendent experience. Other people have described it as America's Sistine Chapel, which I actually think is a pretty good description. And, I think what are the exhibitions that have really, or the museum experiences, let's say that have really stuck with me? and it wasn't about intellectual trivia, like how many drops of water fit into a blue whale's mouth or something. I mean, that's sort of interesting on a certain level, but that's not the stuff that people remember and want to talk with each other about, or tell people, ooh, you really need to go see this, or go to this museum and be part of this. What are the things people recommend? Like if somebody says, wow, I'm going to Baltimore, I say, whoa, you need to go to the American Visionary Art Museum. That's one of my favorite museums. Or you
Yep.
need to go to the City Museum if you're in St. Louis. And they're like, well, people, if they ask you at a dinner party, oh, you're a museum person, you're an exhibit, what's the best museum
Yep.
in the world? And it's
Yep.
like, well, I don't know if I can tell you the best, but I can tell you some I like. And it really, there are those qualities that you mentioned, surprise and cognitive dissonance, or an emotional chord that is touched, and just an appreciation for the sort of human beings that created this situation. Like it doesn't feel like it was extruded from some giant, Play-Doh exhibition factory. So, I mean, how do we find those qualities, or how do we, yeah, I'm just going to say, how in your work, what are the ways that you find those qualities? And I think you might have already touched on one. It's usually, you don't have those eureka moments, in a solitary cell and you're like, okay, I've got it all figured out.
Yeah. I think the recipe, everybody wants a recipe, and recipes are not, they're good. I mean, you need to know how much, you need to be able to follow some wisdom of, knowing that if you put this in, it's going to rise up, or it's going to flatten out, or it's going to bubble, or, but the ingredients for compelling exhibitions are some familiarity with the focus. And let's say you've gotten a focus already, some familiarity with the focus. So it's not just, people who say, we're going to do a new exhibition about the moon, and we're going to start from, looking at it through bottle lenses or something. Like we start with kind of what's known, or what some of the deeper issues are. And then we have conversations about them with different kinds of people who come at that experience with different skills and expertise. And as I would say, expertise can be, a car mechanic, or a bread baker, or a trapeze artist. And who knows what a trapeze artist might bring, his experience or her experience, what might they might bring to something that turns that kind of contemplation or consideration of an object or an idea or a theme into something totally different. And I just remember when I've been in-house and I've been able to organize forums or gatherings or sessions where you bring artists and scientists and historians together to talk about something. It's very open-ended. We don't set an agenda that's really rigid. And when people really get into it and they start coming at it from all their different perspectives, everyone gets something out of that. I just remember how many people have said, thank you so much for bringing me together with people I never would have talked to before. I never would have had the happenstance to pass them, and but here we are, we're all together for a day. And this was such a creative, energizing, interesting day, because I got to see my work from a very different perspective. And that's so interesting. So it's kind of like coming back to this thing about, we all sit down to the table together and we're all equal. We're human beings. We're in this endeavor together, which is to explore the human condition, no matter what the topic is. And when we really do, when we're really open to that, all kinds of things come up. And I think the reason you and I both are so passionate about prototyping is that you start with something that's just one thing. It's a nascent idea. It's a seed. And you put that out there, and then everybody goes at it from their different perspectives. And all of a sudden you're seeing this seed in a totally different way. And then someone asks a question about it, and you think, oh, well, if we put this next to the seed, here's the seed, here's this. Now what are these two things together? A seed and this, and then it's a third thing. And before you know it, it's that kind of amalgamation of lots of different ideas that start you on a path towards a really interesting idea that 9 times out of 10 is deeper and more resonant and more meaningful to people than if you kind of sat there on your own and dreamed it up and then said, okay, now you design it, and then you tell me about your experiences. I know you've had those same experiences because they're unbelievably dynamic and creative.
Yes. I mean, I think what you just said is really this notion of creative partnership, where people are really true partners together. Yeah. And at the end, where everyone feels like they can see contributions that they made to the finished product, I think is a very satisfying end result. I mean, it is not the auteur approach towards things. It is not this very individualistic approach. It is intentionally a little bit of a scary approach. Like, you have to be willing to give yourself over to that approach. And I think that's one thing, honestly, that makes it difficult. People are, as you mentioned before, they're looking for a defined end result. Like, they want to know what the thing's going to look like before you even start really getting into the creative process. And I think that is just, I don't think you end up with the best end result there. It's like what you said about the recipe. I mean, you need to follow basic elements. If you want to have a loaf of bread rise, of course, but there's a lot of different kinds of bread and a lot of different kinds of cake or stew or soup in the world, and different doesn't mean one is better than the other. I think that's sometimes a hard thing for people to latch onto.
Why do you think people already, I feel like there's so many people out there making exhibits that feel like they can do it without, they don't need to, they can start over and do it from scratch without any experience, and don't want to explore different processes or try things differently. What's going on there? I've been grappling with this for a while, because it seems so contrary to the notion of doing something creative together.
I think, I mean, honestly, I think the reason that particular designers or particular companies or particular museums, they sort of get into a groove. This is the way we're going to do this kind of thing in an exhibition. And it sort of doesn't matter. Like, the exhibition could be about bread or elephants or the judicial history of the Supreme Court, and they're still going to approach it in exactly the same way. And here's a news flash: bread and elephants and the judicial history of the Supreme Court are not exactly the same thing. So I think, there is this, there's this constant pressure, whether it's internal pressure or not, external pressure, of perception about time and money. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll just go back to prototyping. People are like, oh, we don't have time to do prototyping, or we don't have the money to do prototyping. And I'm like, wait. You don't have time to test these ideas out or work with visitors on that? How are you going to have time, like, to fix this thing if it doesn't work physically or conceptually afterwards? If you don't even have the time to, or you're not willing to take the time to try something out during the process. I mean, it just seems antithetical to me about the exhibit development process, but
Yeah.
that's just me, you know.
Well, you know, a lot of people say oh, well, that's fine with science and scientists and engineers and all that stuff, but not for an art exhibit. And you know what? More and more art museums are starting to be curious about it, at least at some level. And I'm finding that the people who kind of embrace the idea, I've been working with the Delaware Museum of Art folks, and they really got into it, and they've made some pretty amazing discoveries about and have deepened their own thinking about these themes. And it's not, you know, I don't know why people immediately jump to, well, it's about fun and, you know, engineering and stuff, but not the deeper aesthetic issues of human nature.
Well, we can't do this because this would just be dumbing down things. That's the other great thing, you know, especially in art and history museums. Well, you know, we're not like this circus in a science center or a children's museum. We can't dumb down things. You know, people have a certain expectation of us, and I'm like, maybe there's a reason they have a certain expectation of you. I don't know if that's a good thing, but anyway. Well, I don't know if we've come to any definitive answer, which probably was not the point in this conversation, but to get people.
When the two of us get together and have a conversation, it's like, oh, well, what about this? And well, maybe that, and
we should try that.
But I have to tell you, this was really fun talking to you.
No, that's good. I wanted to put some of this work from home time to good use. Yeah. And, you know, I think these are evergreen topics, the kinds of topics that I've been speaking with people about, you know, all kinds of things. Membership in museums, putting stories in things, you know, how you plan for the unexpected. These are things that have a particular resonance right now, of course, but they're eternal questions. I mean, you know, we're always going to be asking if you're running a museum, of course you're interested in membership, or of course you should be interested in integrating stories into your exhibitions, I would think. So, well, I appreciate you taking the time, Kathy. It's always nice to see you and speak with you. And
nice to see you too, Paul. And I'm glad you're doing well.
And vice versa. We'll keep supporting good eggs, not bad actors. maybe there's the final thought for the exhibition development process and your creative partners. Support good eggs, not bad actors.
Yes, I think that's perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.